Switching gears to Russia to set it up for a confrontation with the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War, we need to dial back to Napoleon. In 1812, when Napoleon's march on Moscow ended in a disastrous retreat, and if you learn nothing else, it should be to never invade Russia in winter, and this is not going to be the last time someone makes this mistake. Anyway, when Napoleon's march on Moscow ended in a disastrous retreat, the European image of Russia changed. Just as Napoleon's withdrawal from Egypt led to Muhammad Ali briefly becoming a political power, Napoleon's withdrawal from Russia conferred status upon Tsar Alexander I, who reigned from 1801 to 1825. Conservative Europeans still saw Russia as a place apart, backwards, and oppressive, but they acknowledged its immensity and potential, and included the Tsar in efforts to suppress revolutionary tendencies throughout Europe. In several important respects, Russia resembled the Ottoman Empire more than the conservative kingdoms of Europe, whose autocratic practices it so staunchly supported. Socially dominated by nobles, whose country estates were worked by the unfree serfs, Russia had almost no middle class. Industry was still at the threshold of development by the standards of the rapidly industrializing European powers, though it was somewhat more dynamic than the Ottoman industry. Like Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, Russia engaged in reforms from the top down under Alexander I. His reforms were more popular than Mahmud's were in the Ottoman Empire, but that was mostly due to the fact that since the time of Peter the Great, Russia had been in contact with the Western European nations. Members of the Russian court knew Western languages, and the Tsars employed officials and advisors from Western countries. However, Alexander's reforms promised more on paper than they brought in practice. It took years to develop a sufficient pool of trained bureaucrats to make the reforms effective. Ironically, much of the opposition to Alexander I's reforms came from the well-established noble families that weren't opposed to the Western ideas, but feared losing their position and status. They believed that new government bureaucrats who came from more modest social origins would act as agents of imperial tyranny. What were some of the reforms being discussed? For one, freeing the serfs was often up for discussion. Others advocated a written constitution and a republican form of government. But over time, Alexander got increasingly paranoid and reversed course on many things, and he never emancipated the serfs. When Alexander I died of typhus in December 1825, there was some confusion about who was supposed to succeed him. None of his children were alive, and his younger brother Constantine didn't want the job. Alexander had another brother, Nicholas, who took power after Constantine stepped aside. However, a group of reform-minded army officers tried to take over the government in what was termed the Decembrists Revolt. Just after Christmas in 1825, in St. Petersburg, a group of officers and 3,000 of their troops assembled in the town center to refuse to swear allegiance and proclaim their loyalty to Constantine. There was this odd standoff for hours until Tsar Nicholas appeared in person and sent in an emissary to negotiate with the rebels. The Decembrists shot the guy, who was in the middle of speaking to them. After that, Nicholas ordered the cavalry charge and ordered the artillery to open fire. Those who survived were exiled to Siberia to serve hard labor, mostly traveling there on foot. This was a sign of things to come. The more conservative Nicholas I succeeded the throne for the next 30 years, from 1825 to 1855. He implemented iron discipline, and suspicion of modern ideas took priority over reform. One prominent Russian historian said that Nicholas I, quote, came to represent autocracy personified, infinitely majestic, determined and powerful, hard as stone, and relentless as fate. Like the Ottoman Empire, Russia was an overwhelmingly agricultural land. However, it had a poorer transportation network than the Ottomans, since many Ottoman cities were seaports. In 1837, Tsar Nicholas I built the first railroad from St. Petersburg, the capital city, to his summer palace, a distance of about 30 kilometers or about 20 miles. Other industrialization was heavily dependent on foreign aid. While American engineers saw the laying of track and built locomotive workshops, British engineers set up textile mills that gave woolens and cottons a prominent place among Russia's industries. Until the late 19th century, the Russian government's interest in industry was pretty limited. An industrial revolution required educated and independent-minded artisans and entrepreneurs, but Nicholas feared the spread of literacy and modern education, especially anything smacking of revolution. Anything beyond the minimum needed to train the officer corps in the military and the bureaucrats in the government was too much. He preferred serfs to factory workers, and he paid for imported industrial goods with exports of grain and timber. There's certainly a connection to be made between the agrarian United States South and Russia at this time. The South didn't industrialize to the same extent as the North, and education was extremely limited to just the middle class and elites. Even the middle classes were basically literate and knew basic maths. Think about the old saying, reading, writing, and arithmetic? That's about the extent of education that most of the middle class received. Poor whites lost out on education, and it was illegal in most of the slave states to teach enslaved people how to read or write. Like Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, Russia aspired to the Western-style economic development of France and Britain, but the Russian military remained far behind. Obsolete muskets, a lack of transportation network, and a shortage of supplies hindered the Russian war effort in the Crimea, as we'll see in a little bit. In some ways, though, Russia resembled other European countries. From the point of view of the French and the British, the Russian Cyrillic alphabet and Russian Orthodox Christianity seemed foreign, but they were not nearly as foreign as Islam and the Arabic alphabet. Britain and France feared Russia as a rival for power in the East, but they increasingly accepted the Russian view of the Ottoman Empire as, quote, the sick man of Europe, capable of surviving only so long as the European powers permitted. From the Russian point of view, kinship with Western Europe was of questionable value. Westerners, like the men of the Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire, put their trust in technical advances and government reform. Opposing them were intellectuals known as Slavophiles, who considered the Orthodox faith, the solidity of peasant life, and the Tsar's absolute rule to be the proper basis of Russian civilization. After 1860, Slavophiles gave rise to the Pan-Slavism idea to unite all the Slavic peoples into one nation. We'll have more on that closer to World War I.